All right, Jeremiah chapter 3. Let's call this one Cycles in this chapter where something's for sale. And the bad news is it's Judah, as 3 times within the first 5 verses, God is going to liken them to the unhappy word for a prostitute. And it's not just in the first 5 verses. He's going to say it at least one more time in the next set of verses in this chapter that roughly breaks down or seems to break down this way. The extra downside to the fact that he is calling them a prostitute is they are not simply polluting themselves in the things that they have done, but they have polluted the land, verse 2. Going on in verses 6 through roughly 11, he's going to say they actually had an example in Israel, the northern 10 tribes, the things that they did that were shady and the consequences that got them. But they looked on that entire incident and didn't learn. Even more, they seem to double down on Israel's sins, understanding that God is going to describe Israel in that set of verses as being unfaithful. But he's going to say Judah did them one better by becoming treacherous, a theme that Ezekiel is going to pick up as well as he describes the descent of Judah into captivity. Going on, though, that is all going to set the stage for what seems to be the dominant theme in the chapter, at least the recurrent theme, as 3 times God is going to call them to return. Verse 11, return, faithless Israel, declares the Lord. Again, he's going to say in verse 14, return, O faithless children. As in verse 22, once again, he's going to say, return, O faithless sons. Addressing them in a nuanced way each time. He is likewise going to have something specific he is calling them to either do or notice each time he calls them to return. That first return actually being in verse 12, where he says, return, faithless Israel. Leading into verse 13, where he says, only acknowledge your guilt. Verse 14, where he says, return, O faithless children. He is going to follow up with a promise in verse 15, and I will give you shepherds after my own heart who will feed you with knowledge and understanding, leading to a renewed period of prosperity where they no longer have to dwell in shame. Understanding, however, that they are in a cycle, thus the title. He's calling them one more time in verse 22 to return, O faithless sons, and I will heal your faithlessness, hopefully ending the cycles. But the end of the chapter ends up in a manner of uncertainty because it actually ends on a high note. But it's not clear how long that high note will last as they begin to confess all the things that they have done. And instead of going back to a time when they confess, but only with a superficial contrition, this time they're going to seem to be contrite. But the question still remains, do they really mean it? Understanding that at least twice in the chapter, God is going to seem to describe the way in which they've been this way before. Returning, however, without, like we said, genuine contrition. First, in that first section, verses 4 and 5, we're going to notice, have you not just now called to me, my father? You are the friend of my youth. Will he be angry forever? Will he be indignant to the end? Behold, you have spoken, but you have done all the evil that you could. Again, he is going to notice in that second section, talking about the way in which they saw Israel's example, but ignored the danger in it. He's going to say in verse 10, yet for all this, her treacherous sister Judah did not return to me with her whole heart, but in pretense, declares the Lord. That last observation about Judah's pretense, reminding me that bad habits rarely look the same in the next generation. To the degree that they are not broken, they usually look a lot worse. Reminding me of the way in which Abraham, even though he was the father of the entire nation, had a habit or a weakness for lying under pressure. His tendency to lie under pressure turned in later generations under Jacob to become a manner or method of convenience, meaning he lied whenever it would benefit him, understanding that that unbroken tendency manifested in his next generation in a number of sons who lied to facilitate treachery, the exact same word used in this chapter to describe Judah. the treachery of Jacob's sons being murder in one instance and in the other selling their brother Joseph into slavery. This time the sins of Israel in one generation led to, beyond mere faithlessness or unfaithfulness, treachery in Judah that God is now addressing, reminding us that just as bad habits unchecked can subtly grow worse from generation to generation, even more subtly, consequences unchecked can grow worse from generation to generation. Understanding that this chapter reminds us that it was not just Israel or Judah that were polluting themselves, but in verse 2, you have polluted the land with your vile, we'll call it prostitution. Jeremiah 3 seeming to show us the way in which insincere change or insincere repentance can lead us into cycles that ultimately prove to be self-destructive. As we seem to have pretty much seen from Genesis all the way through, Jeremiah to this point, sometimes giving us great personal success at the cost of diminishing the trust, the security, and the overall livability of the places around us.